Having been really impressed with the APOS Ray 12AU7 tubes that I received a little while ago and reviewed here on the channel, I was excited to get my hands on the 6SN7 variant from the same brand. And the good news is I've been really impressed by the 6SN7 Select tubes just as much as I was by the 12AU7s, but they've also left me just a little bit disappointed. Before we get to that, let me introduce the tubes. And that's to say that this is a 6SN7 tube, as I mentioned before. That's quite a common tube. It's used in amplifiers like the xDuoo TA26 and TA26S. It's also used in the shit Lear, and I think some of the other shit amps as well use the 6SN7. And this is what the 6SN7 Select from the Ray brand carried by APOS, this is what it looks like. Now I've got a single here. These come in at $65 for a single, but you can also pay a little bit extra to get matched pairs and matched quads if that's what your amplifier needs. As is the case with almost any tube you can buy on the market now, it's going to come out of the same factory that makes other tubes as well under other brands. And so the key thing when you're buying a new tube, and particularly a premium tube like this one, is that it's going to be coming from a factory that you already might be familiar with. But the key thing is that the specifications and tolerances required by the brand that is getting the factory to make the tubes, that's what's going to make a tube better or worse. And as I understand it, the rejection rate on tubes, in other words, the level of tolerance that APOS expect for these Ray Select tubes is very, very high. The same was true for the 12AU7s, and the proof was definitely in the pudding. And so let's cut straight to the chase and talk about how the 6SN7 Select tube sounds in amplifier circuits. To set myself up with a bit of a baseline, I kicked things off by listening to the TA26 that I've got behind me here. This is identical to the TA26S. They've just changed the connectors on the front of the TA26S, but otherwise it's the same. So if you're familiar with either of those amps, this will be a good reference point for you. And so to set up my baseline, I just ran the stock tubes, which is a 6SN7 or a Chinese equivalent at the front. And then I was running a Sovtech 6AS7G tube in the power socket. The input to the TA26 was the Eversolo DMP-A8, and then I was driving the ZMF Atrium headphones from the TA26, listening to Rising Sun by Takuya Kuroda, and the sound from this baseline setup was already fantastic. Overall, I'd describe it as quite rich and smooth. There was a good sense of space around the various instruments and in the overall soundstage, and the bass presentation was quite full, quite punchy, but not particularly tight. And that's going to be a key as we keep moving forward here. And so having spent lots of time with the TA26 and the TA26S, I know that this is a decent, solid sound, but I also know that it can get better. And so this is where we can now start to ramp up by trying a couple of other tubes. But before we get to that, I just want to take a few moments to talk about a brand new channel sponsor with you. I was excited when Aura reached out to me about sponsoring the channel. And I'm also a little bit envious for those of you that can access Aura because it's only available in the USA. Now I thought twice about whether or not to take them on as a sponsor because it doesn't apply to every one of my viewers out there. But knowing that the majority of viewers of this channel are in the USA, I wanted to share what Aura have to offer in case you haven't heard of it before. As audiophiles and music lovers, we're always online, we're doing things on forums, we're buying things online, and so we're always at risk of putting our data and our digital information out there for others to steal or to use for scamming or spamming purposes. And that's where Aura comes in. Think of them as kind of like a powerful guardian protecting your data and making sure that it's never used in the wrong way and or never used against you. As somebody who already uses different apps for a VPN, a password manager, and an antivirus, I really liked the idea that Aura was going to offer you the ability to have all of those tools in one place and then more as well. And so by downloading just one app, Aura is going to give you antivirus, VPN or virtual private network, a password manager, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. And so if you're in the US, you can take all of those individual functions and features and have them bundled into one single app at one single low price. So don't wait to find out how exposed your personal information is the hard way. You can go to aura.com/passion for sound, download a free 2-week trial and find out straight away just how much protection Aura can give you and even see what's already out there on the net that you might want cleaned up. And so thanks again to Aura for sponsoring the channel. Now let's get back to these 6SN7 tubes. As we've already established, the stock sound from the TA26 with the stock 6SN7 tube is already very, very good. But I also knew that I had on hand with me another excellent tube in the Electro-Harmonix 6SN7EH with the gold pins on the bottom. This tube comes in at around about $70 to $75 for a single, and so that makes it actually a little bit more expensive than the Ray tube. And moving over to the Electro-Harmonix, what I immediately found was that I was hearing nuances, details, and textures that I didn't hear with the stock tube. For example, the snare in Rising Sun had a bit more nuance now. I could actually hear the character of the skin across the snare. The bass became a bit tighter and a bit less full and bloomy as a result, and so I mean that in a good way. The bass was still present and solid, but it didn't have quite as much kind of looseness to it as I think the stock tube does. Takuya Kuroda's trumpet now has a bit more texture to it, and whilst the overall sound between the TA26 in this setup and the ZMF Atriums is still quite syrupy, it's definitely a lot more resolving than the stock tube was. And so immediately the Electro-Harmonix at $70 to $75 starts to seem like a good option. And so I was curious then to see if the Ray Select tube could actually sound even better, or maybe it was just going to be different compared to the slightly more expensive Electro-Harmonix. And swapping between the Electro-Harmonix and the Ray 6SN7, I'd say the sounds were different. I'd also say that I do slightly prefer the Ray 6SN7. And the main reason for that is it's a little bit cleaner sounding as a tube. It's a bit more dynamic and energetic because it's got a bit more sparkle and resolution in the top end. The Electro-Harmonix is still, as I sort of alluded to before, still a little bit thick, a little bit syrupy. And that's going to be great for some people. But for me, I like the balance that the Ray 6SN7 brings. Interestingly, I felt like the bass was maybe just a touch fuller from the Ray tube compared to the Electro-Harmonix. It was still just as tight, but I felt that there was maybe a little bit more body from the bass when I was listening to it from the Ray tube. Now, there is a bit of a delay when you're swapping tubes because you've got to switch off the amp, let the first tube cool down, take it out, put the next one in, let it warm up. So there is a bit of a delay. The difference between the two isn't massive, but I did feel like the Ray tube had just a little bit more weight in the bass, a bit more body in the bass. It was still very tight though. And I feel like it's really nicely balanced by the fact that the 6SN7 also has at least as much, if not a little bit more sense of texture and clarity at the top end when compared to the Electro-Harmonix. What that means is that clarity and image separation and some of those technicalities are at least on par with the Electro-Harmonix, if not maybe a little bit better. But the overall thing for me that takes me towards the Ray tube rather than the Electro-Harmonix in most amplifiers is that I just like the fact that it's a bit more neutral sounding. As I said before, some people are going to love the tonality, that slightly richer, warmer sound of the Electro-Harmonix. But what I love about the Ray is that it keeps that sort of tubey, lovely kind of mid-range character, and it does it without having to get too thick. You still get great clarity, texture, energy, dynamics, but you're also getting it with that little dash of tubiness. And so what I'm saying there is that with the Ray tube in the TA26, it still sounds like a tube amp. It's not turning it solid state or anything like that. It's just a bit less syrupy and a bit less thick than either the stock tube or the Electro-Harmonix tube. And that's where I really appreciate the Ray 6SN7. And by the way, I should add at this point, this is not just my impressions from the TA26. I did most of my listening notes from the TA26 because it was easy just to swap a single tube at a time. But APOS were kind enough to send me 2 of these tubes specifically so I could also try them in the Linear Tube Audio MZ3. And this is where my disappointment in the tubes comes in. Not because they didn't sound wonderful, they sounded incredible. The problem is they're quite a big 6SN7 tube. So if you have an amplifier like the MZ3 that's designed with this size tube in mind, you actually can't fit this in without leaving the top open. And that's a bit of a shame. I would love to use these permanently in my MZ3 because I'm not willing to modify the top of the amplifier, and I'm also not willing to run it with the circuitry all fully exposed to dust, objects falling in, etc. And so whilst I love the look of these and I absolutely adore the sound of them, I do wish there was some way to make them a bit smaller, and I don't think that's going to happen. So keep that in mind. If you're in my position where you've got amps that are fully closed in, you will want to check whether your amp can fit something like the Ray 6SN7 before you go buy them. But if you've got what I'd call an open air amp, like a TA26, a Lear Plus as well would be another example, then go for it. They're a fantastic tube, and at the price I think they're as good, or maybe even a touch better than some of the competition, such as the Electro-Harmonix. I believe that in the near future, I'm going to be receiving one of the new Linear Tube Audio Velo amplifiers to review, and that one is more of an open-air design, so I'm looking forward to plugging in the Ray 6SN7s into that one and seeing just what they're capable of in a really high-end amp for more extended listening where I can roll through some other tubes more easily. As it is, they perform beautifully in the MZ3, I just can't leave them in there. And so to bring all this to a close, I think once again, APOS have absolutely knocked it out of the park with the Ray 6SN7 Select here. I think it's very well priced for the performance you're getting, and I love the fact that we as tube lovers now have access to some new production tubes that are just as good as many of the new old stock tubes out there. And so the beauty is that you're not having to pay a fortune for these obscure and rare NOS tubes just to get the best possible sound out of your amplifier. And so if you have a tube amp that takes the 6SN7 tube and you're looking for a great upgrade, but you don't want to go hunting through new old stock and hoping that you get good ones, then this is absolutely a fantastic option to consider. And so as always, I hope you found this video useful, helpful and informative. If you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. I can tell you right now, I've got at least one more fantastic and exciting tube coming up for review. But then I've also got some great tube amplifiers, such as the aforementioned Velo from Linear Tube Audio. So hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, but for now let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.